Pak dan Ibu, good morning Mark Harrison. Selamat pagi Pak Nur, Pak Siringo-Ringo, Pak Danto, all members of IIA and all participants. Welcome to e-learning international webinar today. We are very privileged to have Mr. Mark Harrison who will share with us a very relevant topic, how internal audit can turn the COVID-19 pandemic into a useful post-event analysis to recommend lessons learned. So for a brief update on Mr. Mark Harrison, currently Mark is the president of Asian Confederation of IIA. He is also the president and chairman of the board of IIA Australia since July 2013 up to now. Currently, Mark is the managing director of Santentia Consulting. Prior to that, he was the managing director of Profitivity from February 2005 up to March 2020, leading the Australian government practice for Profitivity. And prior to that, he was director Ernst & Young and director for Arthur Andersen. So I'm very confident our seminar today will bring great benefit and value added to all of us. So without further ado, I welcome Mark to begin the session. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Resti. And thanks for that kind introduction. I was going to say good afternoon because it's afternoon here, but good morning to you all. And thank you for joining us today for this session. One of the great benefits I find of being part of IIA is that you are genuinely part of a network. And so in this and in this time of pandemic, I think that's almost more important than ever. The potential for loneliness, the potential to feel isolated in this time is really quite significant. And so sessions like these, I think, are brilliant in terms of feeling a bit connected. They're also really powerful in terms of sharing lessons. Our environment is changing rapidly, and the opportunity to share and learn from each other, particularly in these challenging times, I think is exceedingly valuable. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I look forward to spending the next couple of hours with you. Next slide, please. Lovely, thanks. So what I thought I'd do is just walk through what the next 2.5 hours will look like. I know that's a long period of time. I suspect people may need to duck away, and so I thought I'd try and map out roughly how the timeframes will go so that people can plan their next few hours. So I'll spend a few minutes right at the beginning just introducing the topic and introducing me, and a lot of that's been done already. Then the session is split into two parts. The first part is around what is the impact of COVID-19 on our planet, on our society, on our businesses, and what at a very high level are the lessons that organisations are learning today and have been learning for the last few months arising from COVID-19. So that's really scene setting. It won't go to where do we fit as internal auditors. Well, that's the second part. It's really contextual, and that's important because that will drive where internal audit can add value. So that'll take about 40 minutes, give or take, for that first part of the session. We're then allocating 20 or 25 minutes for questions and answers, and I encourage you all to think of some tough questions, or if you like, to sort of suggest an area of debate in that 25 minutes, because I really look forward to engaging with you rather than just being me speaking. When I've delivered this session before, it's been in a face-to-face context, and I much prefer interaction as we go, but as you'd imagine in a Zoom call, and I'm sure some of you have been in Zoom meetings which have turned into a bit of a shambles because everyone's speaking over each other. So we'll do the session, do the questions and answers. So like I say, introductions for a couple of minutes, 40 minutes on that part one, impact of COVID-19, 25 minutes of questions and answers. We'll then roll into the media part of the session, which is part two. And that's what's the role for internal audit in a post event analysis. and I'll touch on that post-event bit because that's kind of interesting in just a moment. So that'll be about 45 minutes, give or take. Then another 25 minutes, and that will include a bit of lessons learned activities that I've done and I've seen that have worked pretty well during and following COVID-19. And the intent of that section is to give you some tricks and tips, if you like, on if you were going to do some sort of post-event or during event analysis in your organizations. Here are some of the things to think about as you do that. We'll then set aside 25 minutes again to for questions and answers, and then we'll draw it to a close, which will be, if I get my time differences right, that'll be 3 p.m. my time, which I think is midday your time. So let's get into it. I will start though by, well, actually, let's get into the thing proper. So next slide, please. So a little bit about me, just so you know who's going to talk to you for the next little while, and it's probably worth noting that is not a picture of me in the video. I wasn't that good looking as a kid, but it does actually reflect a bit of my philosophy around my life and around my work. So Restiana talked a little bit about sort of my previous jobs. I've just started a new business called Cententia Consulting. I started it 3 days before the Australian Prime Minister sent Australia into lockdown, which, when you think about it, it's not a real clever time to start a business. But as much as anything, and I'll come to this in a tick, but as much as anything, because of the pandemic, the business is booming, which is great. I've spent my career about 50% of it in the private sector, 50% in the public sector. So and my client base right now is about a similar mix. So I bring both perspectives, and I think that's important because the pandemic typically affects government organisations in a bit of a different way to the private sector. I have been a chief audit executive before. I spent 5 years as a chief audit executive of one of the largest government departments in the country. So I've got a bit of a perspective, not just as a consultant, but living inside an organisation. And I spend probably about, 50% of my time doing audit work, and then the other 50% doing other types of consulting, risk, business continuity, which we'll get to, security, other forms of consulting. And I think that's helpful because it brings a range of different perspectives. But if we go back to the photo, for the darkness of the current world we live in, it is an enormous source of opportunity for us as a profession, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go. Let's go to the next slide. Perfect. So I might just spend a moment just talking about my pandemic, so you get a bit of a sense for my perspective. So as I say, I started a new business at the beginning of the pandemic, and just before the Australian government locked the Australian economy down. Firstly, I should say I've been safe and well, and I'm pleased to hear that everyone that's on this call is also safe and well, and all of my family and my colleagues have been. Australia hasn't been as badly affected, I don't think, as many countries, including Indonesia, and we'll talk about the health impacts of the pandemic on Indonesia shortly. So we've had in Australia a bit over 10,000 cases and a bit over 100 deaths. The thing that's interesting in Australia, and this will become quite pertinent later on, is that unlike most countries, we are now well and truly into our second wave. The first wave probably ended about 5-6 weeks ago. The government started to unlock the country. Most shops, most restaurants, most pubs, most venues opened up. And then about a week and a half ago, we started to see a spike of cases. And now in our two most populous states, we have a significant spike in cases, a significant spike in deaths. So that's kind of interesting when we talk about a post-event analysis, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about, particularly in the second half, I've actually done. So I've done it in the middle of the pandemic. And I think that's probably an important lesson to think about as we come to the end of this, is that a lot of what I'll talk about today doesn't need to wait to the end. Partly because we don't know when the end is going to come, and partly because I think a lot of our value can happen arguably now. But we'll come back to that. I've had two primary roles during the pandemic, two client delivery roles, I should say. The first is that I was one of a small number of risk advisors to the Australian Government Department of Health as the Australian Government led its health response to the pandemic. And as you can imagine, that risk profile was pretty unique. It changed rapidly and readily. And so that was a pretty full-time job. Wasn't one that lent itself to working from home. So I haven't actually had a day working from home since this thing started. Excuse me. But I was a risk advisor for that. As that got largely under control, well, it's not now, we've got a second wave, but it was perceived as being, I moved over to the agency that's responsible for the Australian Government economic response. And I've been doing exactly what I'm about to talk about in this session for the largest agency in the Australian Government and the agency that's led the economic response for the Australian economy, which is called Services Australia. So, so there'll be a bit of lived experience that flows from that. All right, next slide, please. I should note that if I am talking too fast or I'm saying things that aren't clear, or if the connection gets unclear, I'm assuming Resty will dive in and tell me that I need to slow down or something. But
definitely.
Otherwise, I'll keep going. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now just talking about what has been the impact of COVID-19. And broadly, in most countries, that's been across 4 domains. There's been a health impact, there's been an economic impact, there's been a social impact, and then there has clearly been an impact on our businesses. And as internal auditors, that last bit's the bit that's most important to us and where I'll spend most of my time, but the first 3 provide pretty important context. Next slide. So the first is the health impact. And I can say that, most countries, and this is definitely the case for Australia because I was, I guess, with a lot of the Australian government decision makers at the time, most countries focused on this as a health emergency first and then moved on to it being an economic emergency. But the immediate response has been health. Now, despite rapid response in lots of countries, you can see from this slide, there has still been lots of damage across the world. On this slide, the red is the countries with the greatest amount of impact of COVID-19, and you can see that that covers well over half the map. And I think there are a lot of countries where it's still rising. And so I think there'll be other countries that turn red. This data is about 2 weeks old. You can see that where Indonesia is there, it's in the sort of 10,000 to 100,000 reported cases. I believe you're sort of somewhere, as of yesterday, around 90,000 confirmed cases and a bit over 4,000 deaths. I also note that's still rising, and that's a horrific place to be. But it emphasises that the impact on this, first and foremost, is a health impact, which then flows through to the rest. Next slide, please. So the second, that then flows to an economic impact. And all of our businesses that we work for work within our national or in the global economy. And again, this data is about 2 weeks old, I think. But it tries to present the perception of economic conditions currently compared to 6 months before. So the first slide breaks it down, the first graph, I should say, breaks it down by region. And so the Asia Pacific column, which is where we all sit, shows that almost 90% of people or of respondents to this, and this was to leaders of industry, expressed the view that economic conditions were worse than they were 6 months ago. And at one level, that probably is fairly self-evident, not a great surprise. But it goes to the depth of the economic impact. I've seen some similar graphs around the global financial crisis, and that white bit wasn't nearly as high. I've seen similar graphs around previous pandemics. SARS and bird flu a decade or so back. And that white bit wasn't anywhere near that high because the impact of those events weren't as pronounced. And in reality, probably won't be nearly as long lasting as the impacts we're seeing now. What you can also see on the right of the two graphs is how that has gradually got worse from December through March through June. So it's really just a graphical way of saying the economies within which our businesses work are shrinking, are in some of our countries, arguably not Indonesia or Australia, but in some of our countries in our region, failing. And we've got to help our organisations navigate their way through that. Next slide, please. Thank you. Hate it when technology gets away from us. The third piece, and it generally does go in this order, the third impact on our kind of is a social or societal impact. And this slide tries to talk through what some of those social impacts are. And I suspect people on this webinar are feeling some of this right now, or know people that are. These social impacts represent both a challenge for us as individuals in our societies, but also it's also a challenge for governments. But perhaps more relevantly to this conversation, represents a significant opportunity, for our organisations. And we'll talk a little later on about some organisations who have responded really well and really positively and been quite successful out of that. So the first is increased homelessness. As people lose their jobs, some can't retain their accommodation, and so we're seeing across most developed and semi-developed economies an increase in homelessness. We're very much seeing, as people are isolated to their own homes, loneliness, damages to social inclusion, which is in turn having a kind of mental health impact quite broadly across the economies. And many governments are quite fearful of that. They've been focusing on the health emergency in terms of the pandemic itself, but the kind of flow-on impacts on mental health are quite profound. It's impacting people with disability more so than many, often because those people are not mobile, need help, but are struggling to access that help as people are locked down, as their carers are locked down. That, for what it's worth, affects me. I've got an aging parent who's quite ill, and she's in a different state, and I can't see her, and haven't been able to for 4 months, which is challenging, and it's meant her care has been a bit challenging. So again, but it's created again some opportunities for organisations. Digital inclusion. So in economies where digital uptake isn't as high, it's having an impact in terms of creating haves and have-nots. It's also particularly relevant to the pandemic because a lot of organisational solutions to the pandemic and lockdowns are digital solutions. And so where you've got economies or societies where the access to digital technology and digital solutions is limited, the haves and the have-nots, we're seeing a need for sort of other solutions, but B, a higher and disproportionate social impact on parts of the economy, or parts of society, sorry. Next one's home learning. I suspect many of you have been through this, having to be at home and help your children while they're educated. I've been handling that. It's fair to say my son has not been handling that well at all. And that creates stress in households. It makes it harder for people to engage in their businesses. But it also arguably has a sort of an impact in terms of just the pure education of our youth. Indigenous financial impact. Most countries are seeing a disproportionate impact on Indigenous communities than on non-Indigenous, which is again creating that haves and have-nots thing. Aging and social isolation. So that's a bit similar to the people with disability piece. It's creating challenges in care. It's creating challenges in mental health. And interestingly, and I don't know if this is the same in Indonesia, but a high proportion of the cases in Australia, including in this now second wave, are in aged care facilities because people are simply more prone to illness. Youth unemployment. I read a statistic that said that the youth unemployment in the US is now approaching 50%, which I wasn't sure whether that was a projection or current reality. But typically the job losses certainly in Australia and a lot of developed economies have hit the youth first, and the impact on more mature people is later. And yet the youth are those with the least savings and the least ability to, I guess, ride out a storm, if you like. So that's another sort of social impact. And then just generally across the board, financial well-being, whether it be because of loss of job or because some things are costing more, whether it be because social services are scaled back, and because most stock markets have taken a bit of a hit. General financial well-being across the society is been negative, and again a challenge, but again an opportunity, which I think some of our organisations are able to make something of. So I've been through three: the health impact, the economic impact, and the social impact. So let's go to the next slide. Because I think what's most relevant to us and our organisations is the impact on our businesses, the impact on our companies. Excuse me. So inevitably, and we all work in sort of big organisations where there are profound impacts on the environment that we work in, health, economic, social, and community, they will end up having impacts on our businesses. And because the impacts that I've talked about earlier have been deep and profound, generally what we're seeing is deep and profound impacts on our businesses. And if you think about it, what's internal audit here to do but help our organisations navigate deep and profound risks, deep and profound challenges, and deep and profound opportunities. So I want to talk about 6 domains in which our businesses are being impacted. So next slide, please. So first is strategy. So most business schools would suggest that strategies need to be living. They need to be dynamic. And if there's a change in our marketplace, or if there's a change in our economy, or if there's a change in our customer base, the strategy needs to change. It needs to be reassessed. It may not need to change. There are plenty of organisations whose strategies probably haven't changed, or there are some organisations whose strategies probably haven't changed and perhaps don't need to. But the vast majority in the 4 to 6 months that the pandemic has been going should have reconsidered their strategy, their organisational strategy. Whether that be, and going forward, most commentators are suggesting that the level of predictability in the next 2 to 5 years, and the health and economic and social impact over the next 2 to 5 years will remain significant. And that goes again to the very title of this session around the concept of a post-event analysis. I will contend when we get to it later on that if internal auditors wait till the end of a pandemic or end of this pandemic to start to analyse and try and provide value, that'll be 5 years down the track. And I think there'll be an element of missed opportunity. Equally, in terms of strategy, some organisations, I'll give some examples in a tick, have been able to revise their strategy either for short or long term, or for the long term already. But strategy will need to remain nimble. There will be changes over the next 2 to 5 years in cultural norms, in societal values. We've seen that in the last 3 months, and in behaviours, and we've certainly seen that in the last 3 to 4 months. We'll see very significant demand shifts in terms of the products and services that our organisations offer. For some, that'll be demand that falls off a cliff. I don't know if anyone on this call is a internal auditor for an airline, but there's a sector that's struggling. And it's been interesting to watch some, in Australia anyway, some strategic changes that those organisations have done. For other organisations, the sort of demand has gone through the roof. Certainly, businesses involved in the home delivery of food and home delivery of groceries have done very well. Thank you very much. There is also, I think, across, given the societal impacts, there is an increased focus by our communities on responsible business practice, on giving back to the community, on trust. And for organisations who haven't latched on to that, for organisations who haven't thought about how do you reinforce the trust in our brand, that is at best a missed opportunity, at worst, I think quite potentially damaging in the long term to our organisations. For most organisations, the future strategy will be different to what's got us to success in the past. And as is noted there, successful organisations have already in the last 3 to 4 months been able to reinvent themselves. And there's some great examples of that knocking around. A couple that I'll give, and I don't have examples from Indonesia, I'm afraid, but I'll give global ones. So an organisation like General Motors. So auto companies typically have been finding it pretty tough in the last little while, and that's probably increased because car sales is another thing, a bit like airlines, car sales have gone through the floor. So General Motors have retooled a significant number of their plants across North America to build ventilators. No other car company did that, but GM saw an opportunity and was nimble enough to consider its short-term strategy. I don't think it's decided to stop being a car company, but it's reconsidered its short-term strategy to think, I have an opportunity here, I'm going to pivot to it and deliver against it. Given the movements of the pandemic in the US, that's probably a good thing. Another example, and this is an Australian one, is a travel agent company. So Australia's biggest travel agent company. It's struggling. Travel is clearly not happening, so people don't have much of a need for travel agents right now. It's changing itself. It's in the process. It had within, I had some visibility of some of this, within weeks, it had redeployed a good proportion of its staff into some global call centres. So Australia found itself removed and exposed by having call centres offshore. Wanted to create sort of some onshore call centres call centers and contact centers have seen much greater use as people can't go outside and go to shop fronts. So it's converted a significant proportion of its staff and a significant proportion of its short-term strategy into a call center business. And it did that in weeks. So here's an organization, I won't name it, that's been going for over 25 years. And in weeks, it redeployed, it changed its strategy, it found customers and redeployed its staff into a very different business. And that's really clever. Not every organization's been able to do that. The last example I'll give, and again, it's related to sort of, again, response to COVID. A number in Australia. So Australia had a massive shortage of hand sanitizer around the beginning of the emergency. And a number of small alcoholic beverage companies, people weren't going out to bars, people weren't going out to restaurants, alcoholic beverage sales were going down. And so it's they converted their facilities into the manufacture of hand sanitizer. And some of them found they were making more money out of hand sanitizer than they were out of alcoholic beverages. So another example. I won't go, but there are plenty like that. That ability to be nimble will need to continue in the long term. If we get out of the kind of core of the pandemic, people's demand will be different, and expectations around service delivery models will be different. So a question for all organizations is, are they, for starters, reconsidering or redesigning their business strategy? And then if they are, how are they going about it? Is it collaborative? Is it considering risk? Is it simply reactive? Is it well controlled? And this is where internal audit comes into its own. Next slide. I was going to get a drink before you got to the next slide. No worries. Thank you. All right. So next impact for our organisations on customers. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed the way in which we live our lives, and it's therefore changed our attitudes and behaviours, and it's changed our expectations in terms of how we deal with the organisations we deal with as individuals. I'm not sure about Indonesia, but going to a supermarket in Australia is different now than it was in February or January before this pandemic hit. Certainly going out for dinner is different because it's not happening. So they're examples. One of the things that organizations are seeing, and I mentioned this earlier in the strategy piece, but it links equally and probably more importantly to customers, is that trust will be a competitive differentiator. People in society, because of those societal impacts I described earlier, are untrusting. Particularly more mature and older people aren't trusting because they're fearful. They're fearful of getting COVID-19. They're fearful of losing their jobs. Trust becomes important and is a competitive differentiator. And again, I'm not sure if this is the case in Indonesia, but certainly in Australia, the number of ads on television where brands are putting ads up to sort of say that we're all in this together, we're all supportive, is increasing. And they're brands where you sort of wonder a little bit why they're doing it. So an example is Coca-Cola. So there's a series of ads in Australia around Coca-Cola having a series of scenes of people being supportive and trying to touch the sort of views of the customer to go that we're all in this together. And that's to try and generate a feeling of trust between the viewer of the television and the brand. That trust will become more and more important. And it's one of the things I did a webinar with a global webinar with NEC about the response to the pandemic. And my final message was, for any organisation, if you take nothing else away from the pandemic, investment in trust is essential. And that relates to customers. It'll also relate, as we get later, to workforce. But trust is a competitive differentiator. The way we deal with our customers has changed. What customers are buying has changed. Clearly, customers aren't buying travel, as an example. So there's increased buying of other things. And the examples of the hand sanitizer and the ventilators was a great example of an organisation responding to that. Importantly, engagement with customers will much less be face-to-face going forward. Digital approaches will become much more significant. And so, again, an area where internal audit has an opportunity to play is the extent to which organisations have been prepared with a digital transformation strategy, and whether they are able to deploy it effectively is increasingly relevant and important. And there's this new concept of phygital, which is a combination of physical and digital experiences, will be increasingly significant as we go forward. Another sector that I think is, or I know is being significantly impacted is convention centres and convention businesses. And the concept of going to a convention seems quite foreign now, apart from in this way. And there is thinking around, how do you use convention centres? How do you use business travel in a way that gets an element of physicality, but still maintaining social distancing, still maintaining healthcare? And this concept of phygital has emerged as being something that's going to be quite relevant going forward. So, impact on customers, and that obviously impacts our business. Next slide. So the next impact on our businesses, workforce. And the fact that we're all sitting at home, well, I'm not, but most people are sitting at home, is an example of that. The workforce disruption that's come from this has been unprecedented. Both in terms of where your workforce works, what they do, who they are, and how they engage. Workforce strategies at a country level and at a company level have never been more important. And increasingly, health and safety of staff is going to mean something very different going forward to today and going forward to what it is now. Leading into this pandemic, most organisations were going down the path increasingly of hot desking, of not having core space. There are commentators saying the days of hot desking are gone, because you can't assure yourself of what germs are sitting in that desk that you're going to. The footprints of organisations are going to be different. Working from home will become, I suspect, a much more common occurrence. There will be a need for elasticity of workforce, and by that I mean a flexibility in terms of how they're deployed, an ability to change workforce skills, to change from building cars to building to manufacturing ventilators. That's a whole change in the sort of skill set of the workforce. There will need to be workforces will need to be able to learn better and given the opportunities to learn quicker to get those changes in skills. And finally, the way in which, as organisations, we deal with our workforces to create a resilience will change the way in which employers and employees engage. And the concept of check-ins, particularly when people are at home, the concept of sharing experiences, which for some organisations was pretty foreign before, is expected to become significantly more expected. And I mentioned trust before in the context of customers. Trust will equally be something that's really important for workforces. And people will not want to go to a place of work or work for an employer where they don't believe there is a sense of trust about their well-being and their future. And organisations will differentiate themselves in terms of their ability to generate and gender that trust. So that's the workforce impact. So next slide, please. Sorry. Operations. Okay, so operations in our organisations, and obviously operations means very different things to very different places, I accept, but the way the operations of organisations have been hugely impacted by COVID. Organisations that are reliant on their staff are struggling because their staff aren't coming to work, or in most sectors. And so how does an organisation that's normally reliant on face-to-face interaction with customers, how does it reorient the way its business works to be able to continue to operate? And the best example of that, I think, for organisations is around restaurants. So at the time of the shutdown, certainly in Australia, and I suspect, and I know in a lot of other economies, the time of the shutdown, you weren't allowed to go to restaurants to eat. You weren't allowed to go to bars or hotels or drinking establishments. And what restaurants have done is, or good restaurants, some restaurants, as pivot to be takeaway joints. What I've seen bars do is to become high-end supermarkets or stores for high-end goods that they'll deliver. So they've changed their operation. They're still broadly the same sort of business, but they've changed their modus operandi to respond to the new environment. There's plenty of restaurants and plenty of bars in this economy, and I suspect in your economy, that haven't done that, and many of them are closed for good. But it's not just in terms of the sort of the staff and how you engage with customers. Quite profound impacts have occurred to supply chains, both inbound and outbound. So when borders closed and planes stopped flying in, it became harder to import raw materials, whatever they might be, particularly ones that are required on a timely basis. And that's still being felt today. Air freight inbound is limited. Land freight in Australia is blocked by borders, and so land freight within the country is challenged. And I don't know about Indonesia, but Australia saw stockouts in their stores and supermarkets of lots of items, in part because those supply chains got broken. That's equally relevant when you sort of talk about export. So another piece of work I'm doing at the moment is around a program that the Australian government is operating to try and facilitate export of perishable goods. And Australia, being a fairly heavily agrarian economy with lots of seafood, fruit and veg exports, found in the first week of the pandemic, crates of seafood at airports going rotten because planes weren't coming in and they weren't going out. And so that organisations have had to respond to either strengthening their supply chain arrangements, or particularly in terms of freight out, changing their customer base, or changing their source of raw materials. Again, the concept of agility has been essential here, and some organisations have found ways of being able to kind of create with different raw materials what they need for their operations. one of the things that is increasingly will be a response, and to some degree it's a little counterintuitive, is having more connected ecosystems of partners. So arguably you'd think a connected ecosystem globally is a risk because that travel is challenged. At a separate level, it's proving to be quite powerful for some organisations as different countries go through their pandemic at different rates. There are some countries that are coming out the other end, businesses are opening, and they can rely more on parts of their organisation in those economies, while other economies that are at the height of their pandemic are more struggling. So they can sort of move their operations around the globe. So that's that's another kind of component of that operational change. It's in this space that continuity planning becomes more important than ever. I don't know about your organisations, and we'll talk about this later, hopefully, but most organisations in Australia, big and small, either didn't have a pandemic response plan or they had one that they hadn't looked at for years and wasn't fit for purpose for their business. You'd have to figure that will be a fairly unlikely event going forward, given what people are going through now. So that's an important part of that operational response. Next slide. Finance, thank you. So a lot of people on this call, like me, I suspect, are an accountant by trade, even if they don't do accounting now. And all aspects of what I've just talked about have an impact on the finances of the business. If your customers, if sales go down, if supply chains get more expensive, if customers walk away, if employees need support because they're working away from home, all of those end up having an impact on cash or on the P&L or on the balance sheet in some way, shape or form. And the most obvious short-term impact of this pandemic has been on liquidity. This has created a challenge for some organisations, opportunity for others. But the immediate action has been generally a protective one to solve liquidity challenges, but also there's been an element of needing to kind of reconsider cost bases, save costs, reinvest that, which may include investing that in acquisition of businesses. There are plenty of businesses out there that are struggling, which allows organisations with stronger balance sheets to potentially make the most of that. The other thing about the financial impact is that a lot of organisations have had to invest a bit in technology as part of digital response or as part of allowing people to work from home or allowing engagement with customers digitally or changing systems. And so those investments have either come at the cost of liquidity or create short-term liquidity challenges, which hopefully will pay off in the longer term. But those decisions have had to have been made quickly, and in some cases, perhaps not with the best risk lens. There have been a number of different responses to the pressure on finances of business. So centralized control of liquidity decisions, and I'm just going to go through a few of these. So liquidity decisions in many cases are now only being made by the executive, the senior executive. Variabilizing costs, so trying to reduce fixed costs where possible to try and protect liquidity. Drive a different culture and behaviour around costs. Reinvesting cost savings with a focus on growth and not necessarily giving back to investors. There's been a range there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the finance response has been pretty essential and pretty extensive. And again, like a lot of things, rapid and potentially not as risk-based. Many of these things on the screen right now are being done to bring an improved risk approach to the management of finance. Next slide. So the final impact, as the way I've kind of broken it down, this isn't necessarily, this is just based on my kind of cutting it up, if you like. The final impact on our organisations has been tech. I think a lot of organisations before this pandemic struggled with their IT. I'd have to say that this has pushed organisations' use of technology and reliance on technology to all sorts of new levels. And again, those that have responded to that well are doing well or doing okay. Those that haven't responded that well are struggling far more. There has been just in the last 5 months, there has been a massive increase in automation of certain elements of our businesses for the simple reason that people aren't at work. Importantly, using staff that are computer literate, that have a greater ability to respond to sort of digital requirement, has proven to be a differentiator for some organisations over others. That change in technology has resulted in a need to change the technology architecture of our organisations and a need to increasingly drive better performance out of hardware. No, back one, not quite, thank you. Better performance out of hardware and out of applications. The use of the cloud has become increasingly positive in the last 4 or 5 months, as access to physical facilities has become harder, as supply chains have become weaker. The benefit of cloud, where you don't need a physical presence and you don't need a supply chain, have become increasingly positive elements affecting the agility of our organisations. Service continuity, of course, remains something that's more challenged in a pandemic. And as I think has been relatively well documented, cybersecurity risks have gone up in a pandemic environment. In part, that's because there's a greater digital footprint to be exploited, but in part, I think people are recognising the weaknesses in organisations that come from the changes from a pandemic and are seeking to exploit them. So again, big technology impact on our organisations. Now, I went through those because they'll become a bit of a lens for us. We're going to sort of stop for questions in just a tick. Those 6 domains, so strategy, customers, workforce, operations, and finance and technology, will become potentially a framework or a lens by which we can do some post-event, we'll keep using that term, post-event analysis of how organisations have responded to the pandemic. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, so this is a very simple message, and it goes to what I've already mentioned a couple of times. The impact of the pandemic on our economies, on our societies, and on our businesses will not be short-term. And what this slide seeks to present is how long it's going to take by sectors. It's some global data, it's a global analysis. How long it's going to take by sector to get back to a sectoral GDP that's equivalent to pre-COVID-19. And you'll see down the bottom, there are some sectors that are already operating at a pace and equivalent to pre-COVID, if not higher. Healthcare being the obvious example. But then as we get towards the top of that graph, we've got sectors that won't be going back to pre-COVID levels for another 5 years. And so for some of our organisations, for those that are in accommodation, food services, education, transport, the likely timeframe by which we get back to sort of pre-COVID levels is 5 years. And so we've got to think about the impact of these sort of impacts we described earlier on our organisations over a 5-year period. which is quite profound, and again, a lens through which to think about how does internal audit add value. Next slide. So this is a bit of a very simplistic, but it's kind of an interesting sort of way of looking at it. Lessons learned from COVID-19. So this is a very simplistic 5 primary lessons, and it's overly generalised, but it's again, it represents a lens, if you like. So the 5 lessons learned by businesses from COVID-19, which for organisations that have learnt, that have responded to those lessons, are succeeding. Ones that haven't are failing. Are 1, not working at the speed of the customer, not responding to our customers' needs and expectations. 2, not having a globalised market mindset, and thinking broadly about how our organisation can respond in a global marketplace and use that global marketplace to our benefit. 3, technology, not identifying and having the right platform, the right data. Data is very important in any response to this sort of environment, or the right technology. 4, not building an augmented workforce strategy. A workforce strategy that could be augmented by technology, or could be augmented from other sources, or could augment itself from other sites or other parts of itself, and being able to respond to the unique circumstances. And 5, not thinking about the future in a different way. Now, those 5 align kinda, with the exception of the reference to finance, align kind of to the 6 kind of domains of impact that COVID-19 has had on our businesses. So again, bit of a framework that can possibly be used. Next slide. So this is just a quote that I'm going to leave us with before we embark on Q&A for this first part of the session. So this is from the president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and I think this sums up what COVID-19 means for our businesses perfectly. This is the litmus test of our ability to deal with a crisis and emergency. This is the time for us to demonstrate our adaptability, resilience, responsiveness, and relevance. And I think that quote is relevant to governments, it's relevant to organisations, it's relevant to individuals, and in the context of this conversation, it is particularly relevant for internal auditors. Next slide. So I'm broadly operating-ish to, we're working almost perfect at the time. So we've now got about 25 minutes for Q&A. Actually, no, I'm a bit over time. That's okay, we'll catch up. So we've now got about, well, might say 15 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll embark on part 2. So I'm now opening up for questions. Which means I think I'm handing back to you, Resty.
It's muted. Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. It's a very enlightening sharing session, which actually, you know, your last statement is very meaningful for auditors to ponder how auditors actually, you know, can have our adaptability, resilience, responsiveness, and relevance, yeah, in the midst of these COVID challenges. So on the chat box, I've seen 2 questions queuing for answer. So let me just translate it in English. Go back to the chat. A little bit difficult is my laptop. Chat, where is my chat? Just now. Well, oof. Okay, here it is. So it's coming from Ibu Herna Gunawan. Actually, she's asking the effectiveness of the remote audit, especially in the pandemic era. And then perhaps you can actually elaborate with how effective the remote audit concept have been going on. And then whether there is any survey, with regards the usage of this remote audit concept. That is the first question, Mark. The second question, if I may just share from Pak Saifullah Putra, he's asking how the remote auditing in the pandemic era can actually, help to detect any possibility of fraud. So with the limitation of face-to-face on-site audit, how we can actually utilize the remote audit to detect any fraud attempt. Thank you, Mark.
No worries. Okay, so let's deal with them in order. So firstly, and they're both around remote auditing, so there's a bit of overlap, I think. Firstly, have there been any surveys or studies around the effectiveness of remote audit? Short answer is I don't know. I've not seen any, and I'm reasonably well connected to these things, so I haven't seen any. Interestingly, ASIA is in the process of designing a survey that'll be deployed, or a study that'll be deployed across the Asian region over the next month or so, which will have a component of it around that remote audit piece. So hopefully we'll be able to create something or have something for you in the next few months, but I'm not aware of anything right now. Are we seeing remote auditing being effective? The short answer is yes. But the longer answer is often it's different to the effectiveness, and the benefit is different to perhaps the traditional form of auditing. So let me elaborate on that. Auditing, I'm finding, is increasingly using, in a remote environment, is using data far better than what was perhaps done in the past. Auditors have grown up and learnt to rely potentially overly heavily on simplistic, on sort of interview, process mapping, simplistic sample testing methodologies for doing their audit. And I think it's certainly long been my view that if there isn't effective use of data, those sort of methodologies are helpful, but they have weaknesses, particularly in the context of coverage. So what, in response to the pandemic, audit teams, or some audit teams, have learnt to do is use data better, get more expansive testing of transactions or of areas of the business to get more comprehensive results. So in that regard, I think for some organisations, the pandemic has been great because it's prompted and driven that better use of data. So that is an effectiveness gain. What you don't get, and I think this is to some degree where probably both questions are going, is you don't get the face-to-face. And it's remarkable how much an auditor, in my experience, learns just from body language, from face-to-face, from the environment within which we work. It's also harder to learn processes when doing things remotely. So I think in that regard, it's probably had a negative impact on our auditing. Things like it would be difficult to imagine. It's difficult to imagine doing remote auditing now. Can you imagine it 10 years ago when we didn't have this? We didn't have Zoom. Because I've done a couple of audits in the last 3 months, which have entirely been via this, and they've worked pretty well. I've learned to conduct workshops through Zoom, which isn't easy. And I've learned to kind of be able to get at least some of the benefit of face-to-face, and some of the benefit of observing facilities by using this technology. So I think, again, organisations that have, or auditors that have been able to grasp the technology and make the most of it, I think have not lost a lot. But there's no question that you lose something by not having the kind of face-to-face bit. Remote auditing to help to detect fraud. In many respects, the answer is the same, and it's that use of data that's proven to be a bit of a bonus, if you like. If I go to one of the organisations, I mentioned Services Australia, so the organisation for whom I'm working to do exactly what we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about, which is assessing their response to the pandemic. They've given out billions and billions of dollars to individuals over the last 4 months who have lost their jobs or have sort of struggled as a result of the pandemic. And their audit team has worked with their integrity team to use audit technology to design tools to identify indicators of people claiming for benefits that don't deserve them, either because it's not a real person, or because that they have got through other data matching. You can see that they're not of a financial circumstance to be eligible for the support, and that's identified a lot of fraud, a surprising amount of fraud, actually. It's distressing. So that's an example where, again, that use of data and that use of technology has allowed for pretty positive results for auditors in terms of detection of fraud. A lot of fraud that is happening isn't happening face-to-face. It's happening using digital means, because people aren't coming to work, people aren't going to the shop front. So whatever fraud is occurring, this is a bit of a generalisation, is happening using digital means. So auditors have been able to respond to, think that through, understand it, map the vulnerabilities, and then use technology to assess them, explore them, use data to identify indicators, have done pretty well on the fraud front. So I'd have to say, I think remote auditing can help in detecting fraud in this environment. If we go back to a pre-pandemic environment where most people are at work, most things are physical, most customers are at the shop front, it'll become harder, and that will be a challenge. But I go back to some of the sort of themes of the last few minutes. I think the way in which organisations do business will have changed. It'll be up to us as auditors to respond to that and work out the best way to help to detect that fraud. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mark. There are two additional questions. One is quite long. Is Pak Robi Prakoso from the electricity government body is asking, with regards to the risk-based internal audit methodology, the internal audit has been prepared the annual audit plan based on the risks which have been planned from 2019. And now, like say in July 2020, with regards to the risk and the data period and the conditions that in the field, that, as you know, is very much different from the 2019. So he's asking two things. The first one, whether the risk-based internal audit still relevant for post-COVID-19. On the second one, he's asking, with regards to the recommendation that was given by the internal audit in 2019, whether this recommendation should be followed up with regards to the condition happened in 2019. but this might actually, you know, in a way inhibit the realization on the target post COVID-19. That is the first question from Pak Robi Prakoso from the electricity company. There is also another question from Pak Ayi Saiful Bahri. Basically, for us in the pandemic COVID-19, which come in effort, suddenly, and we do not know when it will end. What kind of SOP that could be accurate to be conducted for the remote auditing? Since in audit, we understand that it's not just only IT, but maybe you can also elaborate and share other ways or other approaches that we can do in this pandemic era. Thank you.
Okay. I think I understood that second one, but I certainly understand the first question. So I'll start with that and then we can see where we go with the second. So risk-based audit, still 100% absolutely positively the right focus for audit. The trick or the challenge, particularly for organizations whose risk management framework isn't as strong, robust, agile, is that your risk information, so and it sounds like this is the case, if you're relying on a 2019 risk assessment, just don't. Whatever the risks, your point is spot on, whatever the risks were in 2019, they're different now. I would hope, and certainly this is what I've been pushing with my clients here, not all have been able to keep up, but that an early response to the pandemic has been to do some sort of at least cursory or superficial reassessment of risk. And then use that as the basis for making business decisions as we go through the pandemic. Not every organization's been able to do that, and organizations have done it to different levels of sophistication, comprehensiveness, but most of my clients have at least tried. And so in terms of risk-based auditing in 2020, I would be relying on that and not relying on the 2019 stuff. If the organization, and this is the case for at least one of my clients, if the organization has not updated its risk assessment, then I have done one of two things. I've either one, done at least my view of the risk assessment, because I know the organization reasonably well. I've worked with them for a long time. So I can at least, to help guide my work as auditor, I've done a personal risk assessment and use that to start to direct my recommendations to the audit committee and the work that I'm doing. And that is going to, even if that's not perfect, it's going to be a heck of a lot better than relying on the 2019 risk assessment. The other way I've approached it, and there are some challenges with this, is if the organisation does not have the capacity or capability to update its own risk assessment, I've said that on behalf of internal audit, I'll do it. Now, because I firmly believe, and the independence and objectivity of internal audit is absolutely important, but I believe for our organisations, whatever they might be, survival is more important. And if my organisation has not updated its risk assessment, I reckon that's a threat to its survival, and I will jump into the second line and do a bit of risk assessment work for them to at least give some information, risk information to the leadership group upon which they can consider, they may disagree with, it may prompt them to actually take that further and do it more formally. But I'll use one of, if the organisation hasn't updated its risk profile, I'll use one of those two mechanisms to create some improved risk information to then drive the audit. but I do strongly believe that a risk-focused audit methodology or risk-based audit methodology remains 100% the right way to go. On recommendation follow-up, and it's a good question, really good question. A lot of recommendations that were made in 2019 probably aren't that relevant now, or they're certainly not relevant in the same way. And so I've been suggesting to organisations that they go through a process of reassessing recommendations to determine if, one, they should just be ignored because they're just completely not relevant. Two, they should be modified to tailor themselves to the pandemic environment. Or three, they remain relevant, they remain important, they may be more or less significant, but they should continue on and we should follow them up. I am saying to most organisations, though, if you've got a regular routine of follow-up of recommendations, you may want to slow that down. Management of our organisations are pretty busy right now dealing with everything I've talked about for the last hour. Let them do that. That's probably going to be more important than most audit recommendations. But there is blindly following up recommendations that were made last year. Definitely don't do that. There's got to be some reassessment because the environment's changed so markedly. Now, the second question. Now, I think what I heard, and Resty, you're going to have to help me if I've got this wrong, is some sort of SOP for remote auditing and procedures that don't wholly rely on technology. Is that correct?
Well, yes, that's the questions that we being asked. You know, whether you have, you can share an SOP which could be relevant for this remote auditing. And secondly, because in our audit, it's not just IT, but we can do other approach. That's the question. So,
firstly, do I have can I think of an SOP I could automatically share? Answer is probably no. And there's two reasons for that. One is that they would be kind of proprietary of my clients, and so they won't let me share them. And the second is probably that most SOPs for audit that I see are fairly heavily tailored to their organisational operations. And so it's not easy just to lift them up and go, you can fit in this organisation over here. Are there components of audit standard operating procedures around remote auditing that, are there features of those sort of procedures that I could share? And I think the answer to that's yes. I probably can't do it now, and I'd happily over the next 24 hours think about what are the sort of features of SOPs for remote auditing that I think are positive, and I can share that through Resty or someone at the IIA. So I'm happy to do that. Will there be remote auditing procedures that aren't simply technology audits or rely on technology? Absolutely. No question whatsoever. An audit that I've recently done has been around project management, not of technology projects, but of major construction projects, and I was able to kind of devise an audit program that used Zoom, that used collection of information in different ways and auditing them while I'm at my desk. To be able to give some useful information to the auditee and to the organisation. So I think there is no question there are ways to do remote auditing on topics that aren't just pure technology. Absolutely. But what I'll do, and we may need to kind of move on to the next section of the presentation, or I'm in your hands, Resty. But what I'll commit to do in the next day or so is come back through the IIA in Indonesia there with some features of remote auditing SOPs that I think are particularly common, positive, better practice features, if you like. It'll just be a list of dot points, but it can be a starting point.
Well, it will be highly appreciated. Given the time limit, suggest we go to your second session, Mark.
Absolutely agree. Perfect.
Ya, Pak Pitoyo, mohon screen-nya, Pak.
So next slide. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So the next 40 minutes, give or take, I will talk about the role for internal audit in a sort of pandemic context, and particularly the role for internal audit in doing a lessons learned exercise. So that's very much the focus of this. So I'm not going to talk about necessarily how to do remote auditing or what sort of audits are good in a pandemic environment, and that could be saved for another day, and I'd happily come back and talk to you about that. But the sort of topic here is around lessons learned exercises that audit can do. All right, next slide. Thank you. So, as is sometimes my want, I'll start with a definition. And this is the definition of internal auditing published by the IIA. And I'm going to read it, but just highlight certain things that probably emphasize why it should be something that we do. Lessons learned exercises, it should be something we do. So internal auditing is an independent, objective, assurance and consulting activity. And that consulting piece is important because I believe, and we can talk about this separately, but I believe lessons learned exercises are often not particularly valuable because they're very backward looking. They often are related to sort of environments that won't be necessarily seen again. But in this environment, with the pandemic that's going to go on for years, some real-time what's worked and what's not. What are some of the consulting activity? It is designed to add value, going back to the definition, and it can improve an organisation's operations. Again, in this sort of, particularly if lessons haven't been learnt the way they should. It helps an organisation accomplish its objectives, and I think given the profound nature of the impacts that we described in the last hour, if we can help organisations in terms of the way they respond to that, that does help with objectives. By bringing a systematic, disciplined approach, that is key, that our approach to doing this is systematic and disciplined, to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control and governance. And all three of those would have some role, some feature in a lessons learned exercise. So I go through that simply to sort of note that doing a lessons learned exercise on the response to the pandemic is absolutely front and center part of a useful part of our job. Next slide. Now, during the pandemic, I guess what I've seen is that internal audit functions have been playing one of 6 types of roles in their organisations. One has been almost pivoted from being a traditional auditor to being an advisor. So I see some chief auditors who are effectively not doing a great deal in terms of the normal audit cycle, but are real-time providing controls advice to the executive. And organisations that are doing that, I think, are brilliant in adding the most possible value they can. Second is key controls monitoring. As transactions change, and in some cases transactions go up, being able to change your program to focus on just those key controls in those high-risk processes or functions has been a way, and often using data and remote auditing techniques, has been a way that audit functions have responded. So definitely not doing the normal audit program and focusing just on that. The third has been around capturing crisis response. So that's around audit functions effectively becoming the documenter or the archivist of key aspects of the pandemic response. And that's a great starting point for doing a lessons learned exercise. But I have seen some audit functions who have determined that their audit program isn't fit for purpose, doesn't make sense in a pandemic, and determined that's the way they can add most value. So they're not leading the crisis, but they are being part of the capture of documentation around the crisis. Fourth, they've been deployed into the business. So the organisation determined, we want your internal auditors to be on the tools doing part of delivery of service or functionality of our business, because that's what we need most. Fifth, and this is the saddest one, is when the internal audit activity has been suspended. It's been stood down, told not to come to work, and we won't do internal audit till this is over. I don't see many of those. I have seen a couple, and I think that's quite sad, and I think it's short-sighted, but I've seen a few. And then the sixth, and the most rare of all, is business as usual. So audit functions continue to follow their program exactly as it was designed in 2019, and continuing to try and execute it during the middle of a pandemic. I think that's, I think that's probably even worse than having the activity suspended. Again, I don't see that very often, but those six are just, and it's a prelude to the lessons learned piece. Those six are what I've seen audit functions do during the pandemic. Next slide. If we are going to do something in the lessons learned space, and I talked earlier about in the definition about the concept of a systematic, disciplined approach. So lessons learned a lessons learned process is just that. It's a process, and if it's not done in a structured way, almost inevitably they don't add much value. And so I'm going to spend a moment just talking about a sort of typical lessons learned cycle, just to get you into the zone of what's essential in terms of that process to do an effective lessons learned exercise. So it starts at the top. Inevitably, it's a circle. They always are. Starts at the top with planning and direction. So doing some very detailed planning and scoping of what lessons are we seeking to identify here. And I'll come to that in a little while. But if you don't do that, the process is doomed. You then collect information from across the business around those lessons. Sometimes that's both top down and bottom up, but you'll have a mechanism for collecting that information. You'll then analyse it and validate it to ensure the information you've collected, a lot of which might be verbal, is accurate. I've seen in the exercise I've done, people trying to recreate history or cover up things that went wrong or emphasise things that perhaps don't deserve the emphasis as part of that collection piece. So that analyse and validate's important. There's then a sharing and dissemination process. So once you analyse and validate what the lessons are, disseminating those across the business and sharing them, and then they need to be implemented. There are lots of tricks between the sharing, dissemination, and implementation. Lots of lessons learned exercises don't actually take effect because there's a gap between the sharing and the implementation. And so as you go through a process like this, it will be important to be aware of some of those tricks and to ensure that you're setting a lessons learned process up to succeed by sharing only what's important, sharing it in a way, and we'll talk about this later, that is sympathetic and supportive, and ensuring that there is someone in the organisation that will implement it. It's interesting, that last piece, the ensuring there's someone in the organisation to implement it, has been the key challenge in the piece that I've done over the last 2 months. Is that the CEO said it was important, but none of the executives felt it was their job. And so that's been a kind of an interesting trick, which was identified as part of the planning stage, but proved to be an interesting challenge all the way through. So that's really just, again, a bit of scene setting around a lessons learned cycle and ensuring that it is structured in a sensible way. Next slide. I've touched a bit on this, excuse me. Now, these are challenges that I'd sort of seen in lessons learned exercise I'd done before COVID-19 and the piece I've recently done, but they so are absolutely relevant to the kind of COVID-19 environment. So the first is whether the organisation has what I call a learning environment. So is it an organisation that is willing to learn from its mistakes, is willing to learn from its experiences, is willing to change? If we go back to some of the kind of discussion on strategy earlier about the fact that organisations do need to be nimble, I think increasingly organisations will have learning environments. But if you're in an organisation that in the past you've struggled to get traction on audit recommendations, you've seen that they don't take advice well, it's not an organisation that has a philosophy of continuous learning, I'd almost not bother doing a lessons learned at all. Because without that learning environment, it can be difficult to gain traction. I would strongly suggest you don't try and identify and act on every single lesson. If you go through a lessons learned exercise, you will identify hundreds, no joke, hundreds of individual things that didn't go right, that could have gone better, or the organisation can respond to better. And if you give a report with hundreds of those, none of it will actually resonate. None of it will cut through. So I would strongly recommend that as you go through the process of dissemination, you focus on a few and those that will bring about the best value. Otherwise, again, you won't get much traction. Ensure accountability for acting on the lessons. I've talked about that. Ensuring lessons are genuinely embedded. So, interestingly, the organisation I've done the work for in the last 2 months, I did a whole lot of pandemic planning work back for SARS 15 or so years ago. And we identified as part of that process a whole lot of lessons. And that organisation hadn't really updated the pandemic plan since then, and it hadn't drawn on any of the lessons that we'd identified at that time. And that, to me, was quite profound in thinking, well, we did all this work 15 years ago, and it hasn't made a difference today. What am I going to do differently this time to ensure that advice on the lessons will actually take effect? Data collection needs to be structured. If you're going to do one of these, you are going to collect a lot of information. Documentation, data, representations, interview notes. As part of the process I interviewed 130 people. Having a structured way to A, approach that, and B, to hold on to the data is really, really important. Otherwise, it just gets so complicated. And finally, these things generally work best when they're a combination of top-down and bottom-up. So as part of my process, I got to spend time with the CEO and the minister, because it was a government entity. But I also spoke to some very operational people on the ground, and clearly they saw the response in different ways, and being able to kind of get that allowed me to identify and design lessons that were most relevant and most informed. So there are almost challenges that you've got to think about if you're going to go down the path of one of these. All right, next slide. All right, so if we're going to do a post-crisis review, and I keep using the word post-crisis, noting that I don't think, as I said earlier, I think if you wait till the end of the pandemic to do this, that'll be a long way away. So you've got to work with the organisation to do it during the crisis, and you've got to pick your time pretty carefully. But I'm not convinced waiting till right at the end is the way to go. But I'll continue to use the word post-crisis because that's how the the session was framed. So I see broadly 5 different ways that a post-crisis review can be focused. So the first is documentation, simply documenting what happened. In lots of organizations, there are lots of different parts of the business all going at 100 miles an hour to react and respond to the difficult circumstances of the pandemic. And a minimum thing that can be powerful is just to bring all that together. And so potential focus number 1, these are all potential focuses, is simply to document the response, document what happened for the record. And that can then be used by the business continuity team or the executive or something like that as useful information. The second, technical investigation of the cause. Now, to be clear, that's not the cause of the pandemic. I think that would be a very political and challenging thing to do, and others can deal with what was the cause of COVID-19. But this is what are the causes of the impacts in our organisation. So if the impact was that we had to terminate lots of people, or several business units went out of business, or whatever, then what were the triggers, what were the causes of those impacts on our business? So it's still internally focused, but it's very much just focused on why did something happen, and using that as a form of lessons learned. Because typically that will be because we didn't do something or we didn't respond in the right way, the organisation. Third potential focus, quantification or explanation of the impact. So what I spent the last hour on was a structured way of describing the impact of a pandemic. For a lot of organisations who have been in react mode, who have been just struggling, just trying to survive, they haven't had time to sit back and think that through. Think about what is the impact of what has been the impact of COVID-19 on our business, apart from significant and perhaps not really good. And so I think there is a potential focus just to do that. Now, that won't necessarily identify lessons, but it can be a really interesting issues paper for the executive or the board or the committee around thinking about the impact in this way. These are the impacts. This is what it means. These are the more or less significant ones in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So that might be a potential focus of a post-crisis review. 4, the assessment of the effectiveness of response. So this is the very traditional approach to a post-crisis review. It's looking at what happened, looking at what we did against a framework, and then assessing how we went against that framework. The main value for that is, for the next pandemic, what are the things we need to change to be able to respond better? But it's very focused on the pandemic response. And then the 5th is enhancing organisational resilience. So this goes a step beyond the assessment of the response to go, given what's happened, and it almost brings together all 5. And it's this that I've done for my client. Given what's happened, given what worked and what didn't, given the consequence and impact of it, what are the things as we look forward for the next 2, 5, 10 years that we need to do about our business model to better position ourselves in a pandemic and post-pandemic world? Because again, the pandemic will be around for some businesses for up to 5 years, maybe more. And the environment, as we said earlier, will have changed. So what do we need to do to enhance that organisational resilience? It brings all 5 together and becomes very forward-looking. Next slide. Okay, so I talked before about a framework. If we're going to look at the way we responded to the pandemic, you can just go around, talk to people, and hopefully learn stuff about what worked and what didn't, and wait for people to say, well, this didn't work real well, and that becomes the basis for your commentary. But a far better way, and I think for any audit, not just a lessons learned process, I think you need to do it against a normative model, against some sort of set of criteria. And I would imagine most of you, when you do your audits, you've got audit criteria that you follow. And in doing the process I've been through, I effectively developed, and this didn't pre-exist. It came from lots of reading that I did and other business continuity work that I did around what are the principles of a better practice pandemic response. And then I used this as the framework to assess what happened. And I'm going to spend a few moments just rattling through these. I'm not going to go through them in a great deal of detail. They kind of stand alone, I think. But if there are ones that, and it goes over 2 pages, but if there are ones that people want to explore a bit further, we can do that in Q&A. So the first, strong, active organisation leadership. So the leadership of the business needs to have the capacity, the capability, the engagement, the teamwork, and the focus on the pandemic, and be actively managing it hourly and daily. Second, clear governance arrangements which take effect early and are applied consistently. So structures in an organisation will probably change. There may be some sort of task force or subcommittee that exists. Decision making may be moved up to be more senior or moved down, but those governance arrangements need to be very clear, need to take effect early and consistently, and be applied consistently over the course of whatever period the pandemic lasts. 3, the clarity of roles and expectations for direction from and information to the board. So to what extent is the board going to be involved? Some boards are very actively involved during a pandemic, others less so. But board want to get certain information. So making sure that there's very clear roles and expectations from both parties. Otherwise, what you can find is that the board and management end up being separated in terms of what they expect in terms of pandemic response, and that can be disastrous for an organisation. So that clarity of roles. Timely and robust documentation of key decisions and actions taken to ensure transparency and accountability. And you've really got that, really need that from a defensive mechanism, because if something goes wrong, an organisation starts to fail, whether it be public sector or private sector, if there isn't robust documentation about decisions and actions, then that can have very negative impacts on any sort of post-mortem or in any kind of receivership or administration of the organisation. There can be blame that's then pushed back onto management or the board, which can have civil and criminal implications. So that timely and robust documentation is important. It doesn't feel like it at the time, but it's important. 5, relevant principles-based planning that is in place and understood to guide the response, so that people know what to do. I'm sure, as you all recall, at the sort of early stages of this pandemic, there was a fair bit of panic in society and in our businesses. And having a principles-based plan around how to respond takes some of the risk out of responding in a sort of panicky environment. 6, redundancy in key roles in case of infection or requirement for a break. This pandemic's been going on for months now. I know certain CEOs in organisations that have gone to work every day for months, and that's just not sustainable. I equally know of a couple of organisations where key people in the organisation were infected with COVID-19. There is sickness in the environment. And if you're heavily reliant or solely reliant on certain people who are sick, that can damage a pandemic response. Timely implementation of non-medical risk mitigation strategies to reduce infection and maintain business continuity. So how are you going to ensure education, ensure social distancing, ensure access to sanitizer, all of those risk management strategies that we've all got very used to, access to masks, to reduce infection in our organisations, and having them ready to go. Most organisations in Australia were flat-footed, and they didn't know the footprint of their organisations floor plates to be able to respond and maintain social distancing. They didn't have access to hand sanitizer. They didn't have ready-made guidance for their staff. Next slide. So I'm going through these pretty quickly. I want to allow plenty of time for questions. Supply chains are reinforced to support access to necessary equipment and materials reliably through the pandemic. This was actually one of the bigger lessons out of the SARS epidemic, and yet so many organisations weren't ready, their supply chains weren't ready. So that's a principle. Nimble and adaptive leadership approach with continuous sensing and response. And that's really around the ability to be responsive and adaptive to change circumstances. And again, as many of you will have watched, circumstances and government responses change daily through a pandemic. And what that means for our business is a need to be very nimble, to be like GM and realise that if we start to build respirators or ventilators, that will be good for our business. And that adaptability is really important. Reliable access to relevant and timely environmental and operational information and data to support decision making. Data is king in an emergency environment. And certainly, if there's one big lesson from the organisation I've been working for, which is a very data-rich organisation, is it didn't have access to the right data for weeks, and that really challenged some of their responses. Create capable capacity that leads key disciplines essential to the response. There are certain parts of the kind of corporate services of the business that are absolutely essential in the response. Health and safety is one. Communications is one. Data is one. Elements of the technology business are one. And making sure that you create some capable capacity in those domains is key. Creative and collaborative, yet disciplined and risk-aware problem solving quickly. So that's as a principle, that's hard to measure and assess against, obviously, but decision making and problem solving at the highest level of the organisation is generally one of the more significant ingredients to successful response, and so that's another better practice principle. Two more and then we'll pause. So second last one, sorry. Internal and external communication that is clear, disciplined, frank, consistent, timely, and empathetic. And that's designed to educate, ameliorate fear, engender trust, and enable people to remain connected. That's a lot of words. But the effectiveness of if data is king, and I still stand by that, the second most important element of a response is communication. And that tries to sort of encapsulate what about communication is important in a pandemic response. And then finally, relevant policy changes are made and published on a timely basis. Policy changes around privacy, hygiene, leave, others. So what that is, and that's a lot of words and a lot of content, and it's content that you can take away and use for yourself or modify for your businesses. But that ended up being the framework in the looking back piece on how did we go in the response. They were my criteria, and I think if you can use those, and some they're some of them are a bit fluffy, a bit subjective, but if you can use those.
Cuma terputus kayaknya ya.
Iya, putus. Selamat siang Pak Hari. Pak Hari Setianto, our President of IIA Indonesia.
Selamat siang Bu Resti. Saya kira putus di tempat saya semuanya ini ya.
Putus.
Di
Soalnya-
diserbak kayaknya.
Soalnya di kita semua kelihatan Pak Nur, Pak Hari kan bergerak. Makkunya hilang.
Oh gitu ya.
Iya.
Ah, welcoming back.
Kita tunggu.
Udah back, Bu.
Selamat siang Bu Resti ya.
Iya.
Udah lanjut.
Hi, is everyone still there?
Let's continue. Let's continue.
Let's
Okay,
continue.
people there? Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, I think I got cut off there, but my apologies for that. I'm back again now. Next slide, sorry. All right, so what I'm going to, I don't know when I got cut off there, and I apologise sincerely for that. What I'm going to do is just go through the, in a bit more detail, the 5 possible focuses for a post-crisis review. Talk a bit about them, just a couple minutes each, and then we'll start to wrap up for questions. So, first one I talked about was the documentation of the response. So this is documentation of key decisions and response features. It's a big body of work. It requires engagement across all parts of the business. It involves extensive data. It often requires the documentation to be able to be presented across different lenses so that you can effectively document the response by structure, by geography, by response component against that normative model I've just been through. And being able to present and hold the data in different ways and present it in different ways can be challenging. The key trick with this, and I've described it before, is ensuring that it's evidence-based and that it's not some sort of recreation or retelling of history. It's particularly valuable for government, but I've seen private sector organisations want to do the same thing because it can be relied on later in inquiries, commissions or legal matters. Next slide. All right, so the next one, which is the technical investigation of the cause. So this is really a root cause analysis. As I said earlier, it's not the investigation of the cause of COVID-19. It's the investigation of the cause of the particular impacts on our business. And it's typically done if the impact on our business is higher than our competitors or higher than related organisations. So if it's felt more for us than our competitors or our sister companies or brother companies, then this might be relevant to be able to learn what it was that caused that impact to be so much more significant. The graphic on the bottom is a relatively typical root cause analysis framework. Define the problem, and that's key, is what are we trying to get to the root cause of? Gather data, identify issues that contributed, determine root cause, and root cause, there are techniques for actually determining what the root cause is, not consequential cause. Identify recommendations and then implement them accordingly. A lot of organisations have their own RCA or root cause analysis methodologies, but they tend to follow that sort of approach, and can be so that can be important in certain circumstances. Okay, next slide. So quantification or explanation of the impact. So as I said earlier, this can be important if business have not been able to get their head around it. And I think the value that we can provide is being able to look at it objectively, present it in a structured